Not yet. Okay, should be coming. All right, is that working?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Thank you so much, Mary Bell. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm talking to you today from the ancestral unceded territories of the Cowichan peoples on what is now Vancouver Island. And unceded means that there were no treaties made here, which is really different than a lot of the rest of Canada. By the time that British Columbia joined Canada, the British Crown just decided that it wasn't worth making treaties anymore because they hoped that their assimilation efforts would work. But I didn't grow up here. I grew up on Treaty 4 territory, which is now known as Southern Alberta and Saskatchewan. And this is a copy of the original treaty signed in 1874 between Her Majesty Queen Victoria and the Cree, Ojibwe, and Assiniboine peoples. So I start with a territory acknowledgement because I think it's important and a bare minimum that settlers can do to acknowledge colonialism in this country. And also, you might be wondering if it has particular relevance to the topic today. And it does, because panpsychism, which I'm going to talk to you about, is often attributed to Indigenous peoples. And I'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. But for now, I want to introduce you to this view called panpsychism, which some of you may have heard of. It's kind of getting a lot of hype and excitement in philosophy these days. So what does it mean? Well, etymologically, we can break it down into the Greek for pan, of all. And psyche, of course, carries this connotation of soul and spirit. Psyche was the goddess of the soul. And breath and soul have been features of that word through the centuries up until recent times, when most of the connotations of soul or spirit have been really cleansed from the word psyche. So philosophers today like to think of it just as mind. And specifically, panpsychism refers to the view that phenomenal consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature in the universe. And phenomenal consciousness, I'll say a little bit more about in a second, but it's essentially our subjective, qualitative experience that accompanies our mental states. So, and that definition is due to our very own Dr. Seeger at the University of Toronto here. A helpful way to think about panpsychism for scientifically inclined people is, I think, on analogy with Newton's theory of gravitation. So just as planets and stars attract one another in virtue of their smallest parts generating gravitational attraction to one another, panpsychism says that animals and humans are conscious, not because our brains generate consciousness at some level of complexity, but that our nervous systems actually magnify and organize the consciousness that's inherent in the fundamental parts. And on both of these views, it's worth emphasizing that gravitation at the fundamental level between atoms is so incredibly weak that it's actually never been measured. Nobody's ever measured gravity between atoms. It's just theoretically assumed to exist because we need it in order to explain the gravity between planets. Panpsychists think something similar about consciousness. If it's down there at the fundamental level, it's likely so incredibly faint and so incredibly simple that it might never be detectable. It might have no observational consequences on the behavior of the physical system. And yet it's needed at that level if we are to explain how more complex systems in fact have consciousness. One might think, why would you go in for a view like this? It seems really far out. Well, phenomenal consciousness, as I mentioned, is the qualitative or subjective feature of a mental state. And Thomas Nagel, in his famous paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, defined this as the quality that if there's something it's like to be an entity, then that entity is phenomenally conscious. So you can think about this quality of phenomenal consciousness in different sense modalities. So for example, when you taste fresh rhubarb and it's really tart, or you feel the surging warmth of an emotion of love or of anger, or you smell a pungent odor, all of these are really salient examples of the qualitative features of our consciousness. And this qualitative aspect is separate from any of the behavioral responses that might happen in any one of those instances. There seems to be this real color, this phenomenal experience that accompanies at least some of our mental states. And this, of course, leads into the famous hard problem of consciousness. So David Chalmers came up with this term in 1995. And basically, you can state it simply is how does a physical brain, if it lacks consciousness in its basic parts, generate this new thing, seemingly new thing called phenomenal consciousness? He asked this problem, and it's generated a whole swath of new philosophy in the last essentially quarter of a century. Annaka Harris just wrote this new book a couple years ago, and I like how she puts the hard problem of consciousness. She says, the hard problem is essentially, why is it that when the particles get configured in a certain way, that suddenly the matter itself entails an experience of being that matter? It seems like there's nothing we can learn about the brain that will make this less mysterious. It's always non-conscious matter getting arranged in a certain way that suddenly makes it light up from the inside. And I think she really captures this core mystery. And so this is the series of arguments that lead one to think, well, if we can't explain how it comes out of a physical system, maybe it's just always there in the basis. So William James says, if evolution is to work smoothly, consciousness in some shape must have been present at the very origin of things. And it's worth noting that actually, before Newton created his theory of gravity, people had similar arguments about gravity. And Cartesians thought you could explain gravity in terms of something else, like in terms of how matter moved. And they came up with these theories of vortices of matter around planets that would create gravity, because they really didn't want to accept that gravity was this fundamental feature of nature at the bottom level. And of course, we know how that went. So despite the coherence of the view of panpsychism, it has been called an unmitigated disaster in the eyes of a great majority of contemporary philosophers, a complete myth, a comforting piece of utter balderdash. Isn't there something vaguely hippie-ish, i.e. stoned, about the doctrine? That's Colin McGinn, famous philosopher. Absurd, breathtakingly implausible. It does not even get up to the level of being false. It's strictly speaking meaningless. That's John Searle. Now, panpsychism is often conflated with another view, animism. This is David Scribner in his History of Panpsychism. He says, in the forms of animism and polytheism, panpsychism was probably the dominant view for most or all of the prehistorical era. Animism, a sister of panpsychism, has been called by the famous sociologist Emile Durkheim, due to the particular mentality of the primitive, who, like an infant, cannot distinguish the animate and the inanimate. So I'm going to take just a few minutes to do a bit of a detour actually into animism, because I think it has a really interesting and parallel development within the field of anthropology to panpsychism in the field of philosophy. So animism was originated into anthropology by the father of anthropology, E.B. Tylor, in his 1871 book, Primitive Culture. So in this book, Tylor introduces the term animism, and he immediately says that it is childish, erroneous, delusional, and it's in fact the most primitive worldview out of which all other more sophisticated religion and worldviews evolve. It's important to note, Tylor conducted no ethnography to do this. He relied on secondhand accounts from other explorers and some anthropologists of what they called indigenous peoples. And in this form, notice that animism was built in to the discipline as a pejorative term. It's not that it was a term that described certain indigenous cultures and then later, took on this connotation of like childishness. It's that he literally created it as a term against which all more sophisticated, supposedly accurate worldviews were to be measured. 1871, that was just 3 years before Treaty 4 was signed, which is the treaty that covers my home territory. you can notice that animism in this form of that Tyler put it together has basically been a tool of colonialism to basically say that these indigenous people who believe this stuff about nature are just totally off the mark, and they're children and they're delusional. And you'll notice him using in this quote, which I want to read you. Oh, sorry. Yeah, this is a little section from another anthropologist, and she's speaking here about Tyler's view. And you'll notice that he uses the reference to children again, which is a common racist trope that's used against indigenous peoples. So I want you to notice that, but also pay attention here to the idea of the individual in Tyler's view and where the soul or the spirit is thought to reside. So she says, Tyler argued that in the savage view, every man had, in addition to his body, a ghost soul, a thin, unsubstantial human image, the cause of life or thought in the individual that it animates, capable of leaving the body far behind and continuing to exist and appear to men after the death of that body. Tyler's work was probably also influenced by observations of children. He argued that the savages were doubly mistaken, believing in their own ghost souls, but like children, attributing the same things to those around them. So you get a bit of a sense here of what Tyler's view of animism was, and it was thoroughly permeated by this idea that each soul or spirit attaches individually to each person. And he basically extended that view to the rest of nature to say animism is the view that every tree, every rock, every river has an individual spirit inherent in it. This view of individualism is deep within the Western tradition. And it was probably most famously and most concisely articulated by Descartes. I'm going to define it here as the claim that subjects of experience are metaphysically and epistemically cut off from one another. So we all remember that Descartes imagined that he could be dreaming, and that in fact, the whole world could be an illusion and that could really not exist, and that it could just be his own mind alone in the universe. And this is essentially what it means to be metaphysically cut off from the rest of the universe, is to say that one particular consciousness has no metaphysical dependence on any other consciousness or in fact on anything else. To be epistemically cut off means that the contents of one's consciousness is inaccessible in a direct manner to other consciousness. We need to talk, we need to explain what we're experiencing, but you can't directly experience it. So both of these features really reflect an older view, of course, that you probably already noticed, the Christian view of the soul, that each of us have an independent individual soul attached to our beings and bodies. Descartes channeled this view into his view of minds. Now, Cartesian individualism is really rooted in Western thought, and it's been accepted by anthropologists and philosophers, and even panpsychists who are pretty far out in their thinking about consciousness for centuries. So here's a bunch of different people who've endorsed versions of panpsychism through the years, talking about subjects of experience. Leibniz says that they're windowless. William James says they're shut in their own skin, ignorant of what the others are and mean. Timothy Spriggs says that they are quite cut off from one another. And here he's describing Alfred North Whitehead's view of panpsychism. Miri al-Bahari says they're hermetically sealed. And Sam Coleman says they are annexed to a private qualitative field. All of these are reflections of this idea that to be a conscious entity means to be bounded and isolated from other conscious entities and from the world around you. Through my talk today, I'm basically going to try to point out that this premise has threaded through thinking about panpsychism, and that it's actually really limited our understanding of how panpsychism might work. Anthropologists have started to shake off Cartesian individualism. There's a view that's being called new animism that in the past couple decades and kind of half century at most has been reformulated. Anthropologists have said, you know, this pejorative understanding of animist cultures that Tyler created is really disrespectful, and it's also inaccurate. So they went out and said, why don't we do actual ethnography with indigenous peoples and see if there's anything like what we've thought of as animism? And as they've done this, engaging respectfully, they've realized that one of the core things is that these cultures often have no concept of Cartesian individualism when it comes to spirit or mind, and that animacy or subjectivity is often seen as residing in relationship and in connectedness between beings in the world, and that it's not something that's packaged neatly into separate discrete parts. So there's a number of different key papers in this new animism, and one of the first ones was by Irving Hallowell, and it was based on his ethnography with the Ojibwe people in Northern Ontario in 1960. And he really rescued animism from this term of derision into one of a lot more consideration and humbleness. And of course, the Ojibwe people were the people who signed Treaty 4, my home treaty. And I believe as a treaty person that it's part of my obligation to reconciliation to take seriously the worldviews of the indigenous people on whom my ancestors live on their stolen land. And so I feel a great debt to Hallowell for introducing this term back into anthropology. He originated this term other than human people, which some of you may have heard of. It's in kind of common culture. Sometimes people will speak of salmon people or bear people. And that term came from this paper. Another paper that's been really influential is by the anthropologist Nurit Bird-David. She wrote this paper called Animism Revisited, Personhood, Environment, and Relational Epistemology. So I'm going to read you two quotes, one from each of these papers, just to give you a flavor of how they're casting off individualism. This is a famous passage from Irving Hallowell's paper. He says, "Since stones are grammatically animate, I once asked an old man, are all the stones we see about us here alive? He reflected a long while, and then he replied, no, but some are." This qualified answer made a lasting impression on me, and it is thoroughly consistent with the other data that indicate that the Ojibwe are not animists in the sense that they dogmatically attribute living souls to inanimate objects such as stones. The hypothesis which suggests itself to me is that the allocation of stones to an animate grammatical category is part of a culturally constituted cognitive set. It does not involve a consciously formulated theory about the nature of stones. It leaves a door open that our orientation on dogmatic grounds keeps shut tight. Whereas we should never expect a stone to manifest animate properties of any kind under any circumstances, the Ojibwe recognize a priori potentialities for animation in certain classes of objects under certain circumstances. So here animacy is seen as something that varies from circumstance to circumstance. Nurit Bird-David goes further, and here notice that she actually says it's in the relationship that the actual animacy or spirit resides. She writes, "The second part of the paper offers an ethnographic analysis of the phenomena which Tyler termed animism, largely drawn from my work with the hunter-gatherer Nayaka in South India. Nayaka Devaru, which means superpersons, are tackled as a concept and a phenomena." So I'll just say aside here that Devaru for the Nayaka, as she explains in her paper, are this concept that applies to human beings, but also applies to a lot of things in nature. And it sort of works as a concept of personhood for the Nayaka people. She writes, "To summarize this point of the argument, the Devaru objectify sharing relationships between Nayaka and other beings. A hill Devaru, say, objectifies Nayaka relationships with the hill. It makes known the relationships between Nayaka and that hill. Nayaka maintains social relationships with other beings not because, as Tyler holds, they a priori consider them persons. As and when, and because they engage in and maintain relationships with other beings, they constitute them as a kind of person." So you can see here, she's totally moved out of this idea that spirit or personhood is contained in an individual object separate from another. and that it's actually the relationship that constitutes personhood, subjectivity, or animacy. So that concludes a little detour into anthropology. And let's pivot back now to philosophy and panpsychism, and just keep in mind these ideas of how Cartesian individualism could be challenged as I talk to you about panpsychism. So a core question that panpsychists have really organized the literature around is, what form does consciousness take at the fundamental level? I'm going to explain to you the two dominant views of the answers to this question, and then I'm going to talk about some problems with the two views and then propose an alternative. So the most popular version of panpsychism in the literature is called micropsychism. And I want you also to pay attention to see if you can find the influence of Cartesian individualism in these views. So micropsychism is the view that each microscopic fundamental part of nature is individually conscious. So if physics says that quarks and photons and particles are fundamental, then those would be the ones that are conscious on this view. Where if it's strings, those are the ones that are conscious. Micropsychism just says, well, follow physics. And then the second part of the view says that all other subjects, including humans and dogs and whatever else, are just made up of millions and trillions of these tiny subjects, somehow conglomerated together. Of course, it's fairly easy to see the influence of Cartesian individualism here. It's the idea that each bit has its own little iota of consciousness that's fundamentally disconnected from the others. Of course, this leads us directly into the most famous problem facing panpsychism, the combination problem, which was named by our very own Dr. Seeger here as well. And this is the question, well, how do these microscopic conscious subjects assemble their minds together to form a macroscopic conscious subject? If they start being disconnected, it seems that no amount of arrangement or shuffling or putting them together would ever necessitate that they combine and create another consciousness. It seems that they would always just stay a sea of disconnected tiny minds. This is the most famous problem facing panpsychism. And though Dr. Seeger coined the term, the locus classicus in the literature that's often pointed to is William James, where he says, take 100 feelings, shuffle them and pack them as close together as you can, whatever that may mean. Still, each remains the same feeling it always was, shut in its own skin, windowless, ignorant of what the other feelings are and mean. The private minds do not agglomerate into a higher compound mind. So he's just saying there what I said, and you'll notice that I quoted a section of that earlier. A little further in this book, The Principles of Psychology, is another passage that's not quoted so often, but I want to read it because it really shows you how committed he is to Cartesian individualism. He writes, neither contemporaneity nor proximity in space nor similarity of quality and content are able to fuse thoughts together, which are sundered by this barrier of belonging to different personal minds. The breaches between such thoughts are the most absolute breaches in nature. Everyone will recognize this to be true, so long as the existence of something corresponding to the term personal mind is all that's insisted on. So notice how different this is than the Nyaka view of understanding personhood as a relationship with a hill or a tree or a stream. William James wants to keep every person completely disconnected by an absolute breach from every other. So facing this combination problem with the micropsychist paradigm, panpsychists have said, well, maybe let's start from the other end. Maybe it's not that the smallest things are conscious, but that actually the whole universe is conscious. This view is called cosmopsychism. And it's often built in philosophy by starting with Jonathan Schaffer's view of priority monism, where this is a separate paper in metaphysics where he argues based on considerations of quantum physics and other philosophical arguments that we can consider the foundation of the universe not to be the extremely tiny parts, but the whole shebang. Cosmopsychism adds to that whole cosmos is conscious. On this view, all other subjects are parts of this big subject. So you and I are just fragments or aspects of the universal consciousness. Now, this runs immediately into the inverse of the combination problem. This gets called different things, but some people call it the decombination problem. How does this single cosmic subject fragment into macroscopic conscious subjects like we are? It certainly seems like I'm not conscious of what the whole universe is. So there's got to be some story, some explanation of why I feel more limited than the universe, some account of how this decombination or deconstruction happens. And a lot of panpsychists have basically said, this amounts to the same problem. It's just a mirror image of it. And have concluded that maybe a little more progress can be made in this way, but probably not. So these two views are the main ones that are on offer in the panpsychist literature. And there is somewhat of a stalemate. People try different variations of them, but there's generally an understanding that the combination problem might be so hard that it could just render panpsychism implausible. It could be as difficult to solve the combination problem as it is to solve the hard problem of consciousness. Namely that it could be as hard to explain how minds combine as it is to explain how mind comes out of something with no mind at all. So what are we to do in this situation? Well, here's Luke Roelofs, who is another University of Toronto person. He did his PhD here. I think he graduated 4 or 5 years ago. And in his book on panpsychism, he writes in a way that pays attention to Cartesian individualism. He says, I just got to move this so I can see. Whoops, sorry. Sorry, the view, I'm covered. Oh, gosh. Maybe I can just do it. Technical difficulties. Okay, I'm just going to try to do it. The views of you all is covering half the quote, so I might have a hard time reading it. He says, it's an easy, intuitive idea, and it might have been true. We might have inhabited a world where every mind was a true unit, with a precise and objective boundary between itself and the rest of the world. Plenty of philosophers have defended such a view, and it is arguably implicit in the widespread view that for each human being, there's a distinct entity, a soul, which can and hopefully will survive dissolution of the body. But that world of sharply bounded minds does not seem to be the world we inhabit. Insofar as scientific investigation of the world has revealed no fundamental physical breaks in the fields of matter and energy whose perturbations make up human brains and bodies and everything else, scientific investigation gives us reason to prefer the rival hypothesis, that there's just one big surface, one big phenomenal field. Our two, I think it says lamps, illuminate different sections of the same surface. Our two brains enable different introspective awareness of different subfields of the same phenomenal field. So the view that Roelofs is gesturing at here, he stops short of endorsing for reasons that I will explain in a moment. But before that, I just want to get on the table a view that might be called field panpsychism. It's the view that consciousness is fundamentally a continuous field in which apparently isolated subjects are actually wave formations. So on this view, the field of consciousness connects all minds together, and that what we think of as disconnected subjects are really fundamentally connected. So instead of a bounded subject on the Cartesian model, on this view, a subject might look like this and be akin to a cloud or a mountain, in that the boundaries between them and the rest of the world is fuzzy. It fades off and blends into its surroundings without discernible edge. Now, thinking about subjects like this is really non-intuitive for Western steeped minds. Even so, a couple of people in the literature have also referenced this idea that panpsychism could work like this. Barbara Montero says that panpsychists should think of the fundamental nature of the world as comprising not discrete particles, but rather a continuous expanse of consciousness, what might be called psych. If our current physics is in the right ballpark, Particles may correspond to the fields of quantum field theory, or sorry, it's covered up. And fields, if our current physics is on track, are both fundamental and continuous. I'm gonna have to move this or else I can't read these quotes. Let's see if I can do this. I just need to minimize these little views. Let me just punch out of here for a half a second. Oh, there, okay, that's what I need to do. Now I'm not gonna be able to see you, but I'll be able to read my quotes. All right, sorry about that. So there's very few other references to this idea of field panpsychism in the literature. And in fact, there are more references to people disparaging the possibility of it. Sam Coleman says, the idea that subjectivity could exist somehow in general as a blanket quantity, apt to being broken down and reformed like dough, seems obviously incoherent. John Searle says, consciousness cannot be spread across the universe like a thin veneer of jam. So I think behind a lot of the resistance to this view is a commitment to Cartesian individualism, which basically stands as a roadblock to developing this kind of panpsychism. So with the rest of my time, I'm going to try to address some of these objections to the idea of field panpsychism that have been articulated. I believe that all of them are rooted in Cartesian individualism. And I think that it's possible for the panpsychist to respond to each of them. So the first problem might be called the privacy problem. So privacy is the widely accepted claim that conscious subjects cannot directly access one another's experiences. I talked of this before when I introduced Cartesian individualism. Now, one might think that's fine if you are bounded subjects like Descartes thought, but if you are an unbounded subject, this might lead to problems. In other words, doesn't field panpsychism lead to telepathy? Could we access one another's minds in ways that it just seems like, at least to a lot of people, that we just don't? Well, Luke spies this, Roloff spies this problem, and he says, well, maybe not so fast. Maybe we can get around this. He says there could be direct influence between minds, but such an influence would be so faint that we will not be able to use it to learn anything specific about each other's experiences. It will blur together with the influence of everything else in the universe, and it will have been present constantly throughout our lives, so that we will have no idea what it would be like to live without it. Given this, what evidence do we have that this influence is not actually being exerted? How do we know that in a world of fundamentally separate minds, like the world envisaged by Descartes, we would not have lived all of our lives with a slightly different background field to our experiences, though without ever being able to identify it because we never had anything to contrast it with? So he's basically saying, you know, maybe there's a faint overlap between our minds that's just always there, and we never notice it because it's always there. Still, Roloff thinks that there is a problem with privacy, but this is not it. The problem, he says, is that a central fact about consciousness, which distinguishes it from physical properties, is that it is subjective rather than objective. Of course, these terms have many meanings, but the idea here is that my consciousness is specifically mine and directly knowable exclusively by me in a way that contrasts with public facts about material things. In denying privacy across the board, we might lose our grip on a seemingly crucial difference between experiential and physical properties. So this is the problem, Roloff thinks, is that doesn't rejecting privacy erase the subject-object distinction? I'm going to argue now that it doesn't. And I'm going to do so through turning your attention to a real-world case. This is Krista and Tatiana Hogan. They're twins born in Vancouver in 2006. They live in Vernon now, I believe, in the interior. They are craniopagus twins, which means they're joined at the cranium and the brain. CBC News did an article on them. They've been all over the news. This is what CBC wrote a couple years ago. The structure of the twins' brains make them unique in the world. Their brains are connected by a thalamic bridge, connecting the thalamus of one with that of the other. The thalamus acts like a switchboard, relaying sensory and motor signals and regulating consciousness. Krista and Tatiana Hogan share the senses of touch and taste and even control one another's limbs. Tatiana can see out of both of Krista's eyes, while Krista can only see out of one of Tatiana's. The twins say they know one another's thoughts without having to speak. Talking in our heads is how they describe it. Now, does a single experience, say a certain smell, that these twins mutually have access to mean that that smell ceases to be a subjective property and becomes an objective property? I don't think so. I think whatever's in their consciousness, even though it's not private between the two of them, it remains subjective. It doesn't become objective. And I think that this applies generally. And to see that, consider a more extreme case in which all people on the planet have our amygdalas removed, and we have our brains wirelessly linked up to an artificial amygdala. So essentially, we all share the same amygdala. Now, when any one of us feels a pang of fear, we all feel the pang of fear in the same way that Krista and Tatiana Hogan do. Now, the question is, this fear is no longer private. It's a completely publicly accessible feature of the world. And yet, does it become a physical property, or does it remain experiential? I think it remains experiential. This leads us to the paradoxical conclusion that subjective properties need not be private properties. It's a bit odd. Usually those are thought to be the same thing, but here they come apart. And it suggests that actually the distinction between subjective and objective properties doesn't rely on minds being private, on them being disconnected from one another. It relies on something else. So what else might it rely on? Well, I don't have a lot of time to go into this, and I'll just mention it in passing, but I think plausibly it relies on another distinction that panpsychists are fond of making, and that is between intrinsic and extrinsic properties of matter. So Philip Goff describes this quite clearly when he says, physics tells us what matter does, but it tells us nothing about how it is in and of itself. So what he's meaning here is that physics describes things in terms of things having mass or charge, but what's mass for physicists? It's the propensity to resist acceleration or to attract other objects. And both of those are descriptions of the behavior of mass. But what is mass in itself? That is a question that science is silent on. Panpsychists have already said maybe consciousness is the intrinsic property of matter. I think it's natural to say that this is the root of the distinction between subjective and objective. So subjective properties could be the intrinsic properties of matter, and these are accessible through being a system. If you are identified with it, if there's something it's like to be it, then you experience them. Objective properties are the extrinsic properties of matter. These are ones that you can observe through observing what the system does, how it behaves, which means how it interacts with other systems. So I'll leave that there, but basically, I think it's quite clear that privacy is not required to maintain this distinction between subjective and objective properties, and that the panpsychist can safely reject privacy completely without causing that problem. Now I'll move on to the second problem that people have posed for a view like field panpsychism. It's to do with perspectives. So here's an ancient red cedar on the west coast of Vancouver Island in Pacheedaht territory. This is probably an 800-year-old tree. Here's my friend Clementine leaning up against a small tree in the bottom right, and she's looking at this tree. Now, perspective, of course, could change if she walked around the tree. She would see this tree from different angles. She could walk this way, she could walk that way. A number of philosophers have thought there's something about having a perspective that means that consciousness is fundamentally disconnected from other perspectives. Sam Coleman says that a given subject has a particular point of view, which is another word for perspective, can be taken as saying that there exists a discrete sphere of conscious experiential goings on. A subject then can be thought of as a point of view annexed to a private qualitative field. Miri Albahari says that any subject's cognoscensory imagery by virtue of being present to a perspectival locus, seems hermetically sealed into that perspective, unavailable to any other subject, which confers on the subject a sense of separation from other subjects. So they're saying here essentially that it's having a point of view that means you are disconnected from other points of view. Doesn't having a perspective mean a subject is necessarily cut off from other subjects? I don't think it does. I'm going to argue that perspective as a property can predicate a field just as easily as it could predicate an individual little point. So here's just a dictionary definition of point of view from Oxford. It says the position from which something or someone is observed. And notice here, there's no reference to it being isolated or hermetically sealed or annexed to its own little world. Think of that tree again and moving around it. Follow Clementine here and think of the field that would be traced out if you moved around it. You might be able to map the views of the tree onto a surface like this. This isn't the right shape, of course, it's just one I found, but there would be some shape where you could map how that tree looks from every different point of view. Now, of course, as she moves, it's going to be smooth between the different positions. A perspectival field, I want to suggest, is a field of subjectivity made up of points of view, each of which retains relative individuality, yet which are continuous with one another. As we move along the field from one point to the next, we smoothly change perspectives, but there's no fundamental break in subjectivity between the points of view. So I'm thinking here of a perspectival field on analogy with fields that are already accepted in physics. And those fields have a number of really important properties. Sunny Ayang, who's a physicist and a philosopher of physics, writes that a fundamental field of physics is a freestanding and undecomposable unity by itself. It cannot be taken apart materially, unlike a string of beads that can be decomposed into beads. The parameter of position allows us to distinguish points, but they are points in the field and are meaningless when detached from the field. So essentially, he's really pointing out that continuity in a field is a fundamental attribute. A field is not just a set of disconnected things packed closely together. It's fundamentally connected. The same would apply to the perspectival field. While a field of subjectivity is made up of points of view, no point of view can be isolated from the field and continue to exist on its own. This makes the perspectival field different from a set of microsubjects packed closely together. Thus, field panpsychism is different than micropsychism. So this is really important because some people might say, well, field panpsychism is just a version of micropsychism all packed together, but it's not, because actually no individual point has ontological existence on its own. It's fundamentally connected. Now, Sam Coleman and Miri Albahari would say, balderdash, this is impossible. You can't make a field out of points of view because fundamentally points of view cannot combine. There's really no such thing as a quantity of point of viewedness, right, Sam Coleman, or perspective. Points of view are binary entities. They exist wholly or not at all. Talk of subjects contributing quantities of point of viewedness to other subjects could really only mean the contribution of experiential contents. Perhaps by telepathy, you could add to my stock of experience qualitative elements by giving me access to your chocolate qualia. But this isn't to add any of your perspective to mine, only to add a bit of what yours is a perspective on. Now, I think that we have a counterexample that proves Coleman wrong right before our eyes. So each retina, which is the source of the locution point of view, combines in many healthy humans with another retina, which has a different point of view to create our overall visual point of view. And notice here that when this combination happens, both the contents, the thing you're looking at, gets combined, but also the perspective itself gets combined. And the fact that the perspective gets combined leads to a new dimension of consciousness, depth perception. So this totally contradicts what Coleman says here, and that in fact, our normal three-dimensional vision is predicated on two points of view combining their perspectives to generate a new dimension of visual consciousness. I think we can go further. I think that actually the retina is itself an example of a perspectival field. So remember that points of view were defined as the position from which something is observed. Our retinas, of course, are made up of individual rods and cones. Each one of them either fires or does not fire based on how much light it is receiving. It might be weird to think about these as points of view, but I think it's not incoherent. They could be seen as incredibly rudimentary types of points of view. For example, if you just had one rod in your entire eye, you could still tell things about the world. You could tell whether it's night or day. You could tell which of the rooms in your house has the lights on if someone was kind enough to lead you around. So I think these can be conceived as rudimentary points of view. And really our vision is dependent upon them being collected into a field, exactly as I described. And that our retinas are surfaces and not points of view. And that the term point of view is really a metaphor that people use. But if you really look at our anatomy and our sensory biology, it's more accurate to say that we have sensory surfaces. Now I'm talking about vision here. Think about touch. It's even more obvious that there's no point at which we experience touch. It's a field across our bodies. Other sensory modalities, similarly, I think, fail to conform to this idea that our consciousness comes into a single point of view. So I think the objection that perspectives are necessarily encapsulated in an annexed, hermetically sealed subject that's disconnected from other points of view just doesn't hold up. Our basic biology says that we are fields of subjectivity. So now here's the last problem for field panpsychism. Greg Rosenberg writes that perhaps experiencing subjects could outrun the boundaries of the primitive individuals of physics. Here, the trap concerns stopping the flow of interaction. This makes for the possibility of a universal subject of experience, perhaps some kind of cosmic consciousness. Unfortunately, no room exists for the more mundane, middle-level boundaries necessary for human consciousness to exist. This view banishes middle-level individuals from existence. So basically, Greg Rosenberg is saying here, if you had a view like field panpsychism, why don't all of these waves, which are subjects, just collapse into a cosmic subject? And he's essentially saying that, look, field panpsychism is unstable. It collapses into cosmopsychism, or else you have to go in for micropsychism. Those are the two stable options. You can't have the middle road. I just think that this is not true. If we pay attention to waves in other media, such as on the ocean, we see that waves are not banished from existence by being parts of a larger ocean. And in general, medium-sized parts of things do not just disappear even because they're part of something larger. They have a relative individuality and a relative stability that underlies their existence for whatever time they exist before they pass away. Furthermore, field panpsychism, unlike cosmopsychism, does not include the hypothesis that the entire universe is a subject, out of which all smaller subjects derive. And this is the reason that field panpsychism is not cosmopsychism. In fact, the field panpsychist remains neutral on the existence of a cosmic level subject. Since subjects for the field panpsychists are waves in the continuum of consciousness, whether or not a cosmic level subject exists depends on the particular architecture of the universal field. So it could be that the whole universe is a subject if the fields of the universe, the quantum fields, are configured in the right way. Well, we just don't know. It could also be that it's not the case, and that maybe humans are the largest, entities that could be considered a coherent subject. We're not sure. That depends on the particular configuration of the field. So clearly, field panpsychism is not cosmopsychism. I pointed out earlier, it's not micropsychism. That takes me, I've just got a couple slides left. So those were the three main objections that I believe thread through the literature on panpsychism that stand in the way of developing a view like this. And before concluding, I just want to suggest that there's actually two Cartesian assumptions that are really standing in the way of philosophers and scientists understanding how consciousness could fit into the natural world. The first one is materialism. So as we know, Descartes, of course, was a dualist about human beings, but in terms of the non-human world, he was a pure materialist. He said that the physical world is a machine that lacks sentience or consciousness or awareness. And of course, we can do what we want with it because it is of that nature. Panpsychists reject this. They say, no, matter inherently has subjectivity built into it. Now, the other Cartesian assumption is about what it means to be a subject of experience. Of course, as we've seen, as I've been stressing, Descartes says that to be a subject means to be isolated from other subjects. Now, I think if you're a panpsychist and you already think consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous throughout the universe, it's really natural to think it's also continuous, and that what we think of as isolated subjects are just waves or structures in this field. And the view that results is not only, as Barbara Monteiro suggested, more harmonious with our best physics, which says that the universe is made of a set of continuous quantum fields, but it also is potentially more in line with what indigenous cultures have actually claimed about the nature of subjectivity. And furthermore, it leads to opening the door to different possibilities of how subjects might combine and interact with one another in ways that are very different than thinking about subjects as isolated Cartesian minds. So in summary, Cartesian individualism has deeply shaped Western thinking about panpsychism in philosophy and about animism in anthropology. Derision of panpsychism and animism is linked to racism against indigenous peoples. And I think this is really important for philosophers and anthropologists to recognize. Field panpsychism is a distinct and compelling middle path between micropsychism and cosmopsychism. And it comes into view only when Cartesian individualism is rejected. I think field panpsychism can adequately respond to the privacy problem, the perspective problem, and the collapse problem. And so it's worthy of further research. Open questions include, how might field panpsychism integrate with quantum field theory? I haven't commented on that at all. How does subject combination work on field panpsychism? I wrote into the abstract of this talk that there would be a focus on this question, and I haven't mentioned it at all. So I apologize for that bit of a shift, but that is a very interesting question. And third, how can work on panpsychism be better guided by indigenous ontologies of nature? I've just pointed out the tip of the iceberg in what happens when we pay attention to other cultural worldviews, and that they actually might be able to show us where our blind spots exist and the things that Western thinkers are so deeply and widely assuming that we might not even question to question. And I think that taking the lead of indigenous peoples on these questions may lead to more fruitful results. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Greg, for the excellent presentation. That was wonderful. So we'll open up the floor to questions. We have some time now, so feel free to raise your hand or type in the chat and I can read it out.